Hello, and welcome back to our next episode of Watts and Drops. I'm Kirby Dolak of LCTV, and today we're here with Corey Godfrey, Littleton Water Department Environmental Analyst. Just as a quick refresher, we met last time with Nick Lawler, General Manager of Littleton Light and Electric Department, and Water Department, I should say, who explained the history and effects of PFAS to Littleton residents. Please view Episode 3 for more PFAS-specific details. Corey, thanks for coming today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate the opportunity.
Good. We're going to talk a little bit more about the practical steps that the Water Department's going to use to dealing with this per and poly fluoroalkyl substances. Now that I've said it, you don't have to repeat it. Also known as PFAS. Corey, starting off, does the process of dealing with water contaminants have any historical precedents, examples of what Littleton has done, particularly the Water Department, to safeguard our water supply? And because of this history, have any special programs been established that acted as guidelines that we can use in light of the PFAS contaminants?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. Actually, back in 1978, the Acton Water District discovered an emerging contaminant at the time known as trichloroethylene. And as a result of that, they had to shut down 2 of their wells, losing 70% of Acton's water supply. So it was a pretty major issue at the time. They went and installed emergency temporary treatment and then put in permanent treatment eventually, which is there to this day. And at that time, Littleton, being forward-thinking, saw the results over there in Acton and decided they were going to go ahead and sample their wells here in Littleton to see if they had that same contaminant. Now, luckily they didn't, but that was sort of the genesis of the aquifer protection program that we rely upon to this day to protect our water sources. They went ahead and hired a consultant at the time, explored additional sources of water supply in Littleton, established a aquifer protection zoning district that regulates certain land uses within the aquifer for Littleton, also requires groundwater monitoring, a whole host of activities that we undertake to this day to protect our water resources here in Littleton. And so now, once again, we're presented with a familiar scenario. Another neighboring town, this time Air, has discovered an emerging contaminant in 2 of their wells, known as PFAS. One of those wells had levels so high they had to shut it down immediately and install emergency treatment there. And the other well, which is Air's Spectacle Pond well, had lower levels, but still levels of concern. And that prompted us to once again go out and proactively sample our Spectacle Pond well, which is just on the other side of the pond, to see if we also had those levels.
What are the operational steps that the Water Department has followed since the discovery of these PFAS contaminants?
Well, so we found levels of 25 parts per trillion, that's trillion with a T, in our Spectacle Pond well, which wasn't too surprising considering Air's Spectacle Pond well had similar levels. And we weren't too concerned because we kind of expected to find levels of around that number, and because the current Massachusetts guideline for PFAS and the federal guideline for PFAS levels is 70 parts per trillion. So we were well below that, assumed there wouldn't be any negative health effects or anything like that. But then as we did some follow-up sampling and started discussing the results with Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, we learned that they are actually looking at establishing a new drinking water standard for PFAS at 20 parts per trillion as soon as this January, maybe February 2020. So since we learned that, we decided to minimize usage of our Spectacle Pond well as much as possible. We're not able to completely remove it from service since it's critical to meeting water supply for the town of Littleton. But in the meantime, while we look at more permanent solutions, what we can do is all do our best to conserve water, use less water, and the less water everyone uses in Littleton, the less need there is for us to run that well.
I noticed that we all got shipped a newsletter which did some very good explanation about PFAS this past, I think Thursday or so was a news release that went out. But have PFAS only been found in our spec pond? I mean, we've been talking a lot about spec pond, but what about other wells?
Yeah, so we have 3 well sites in Littleton. Our Spectacle Pond site, like I said, we found 25 parts per trillion there. Our initial sampling found 7 parts per trillion at our Beaver Brook wells. And then we found non-detectable levels at our Whitcomb Ave wells, which was good news. But then as we did some follow-up sampling, we used some more sophisticated laboratory methods, and we actually found 5 parts per trillion at our Whitcomb Ave wells. So we have PFAS at all 3 of our well sites, one of them significantly higher than the other 2, and that's the one that we're focusing on for treatment for now.
Okay, that's one thing from the newsletter that I took away was that, Littleton Water Department, it's doing its best to, one, be proactive in the process, but I understand that, through my own research that there are ways to measure and detect this. So I can understand that when we got the second analysis back, we did start finding different things. But from a planning and a operational perspective, how has the water department broken down the possible treatment scenarios of this new water contaminant at Speck Pond, and what must be done immediately?
Yeah, well, so, like I said, we're limiting usage of the Spectacle Pond well in the immediate term. And then in the slightly longer term, we're working with an engineering firm to design and install temporary treatment facilities that would be located at the Spectacle Pond well. And those, if the Mass DEP establishes the drinking water standard at 20 parts per trillion in January, like they tell us they're going to, we'll most likely need to have that emergency treatment installed in January or February, since we can't go without that well, especially as we head into the summer months where water usage tends to increase.
Why don't you explain to us the temporary water treatment processes that we're going to plug into our public water distribution system? How expensive is this process? Who's responsible for monitoring the process?
Yeah, so we would most likely install, we'd basically install a 1-year rental of either granular activated carbon or anion exchange filter media. So those are filter technologies. They come in 24-foot tall filter vessels, probably 6-foot diameter, so they're fairly large. We do have some room inside of our existing Spectacle Pond treatment facility, so we're hoping to fit them in there. We're doing all the engineering on that right now. Those would be installed. They'd most likely be operated and monitored by our own staff with some technical support from the vendor or supplier of the equipment. And costs are not cheap. They're estimated at about $2.5 million per year, and that's just a rental for 1 year.
Wow.
That includes all the upfront installation costs and everything as well. But so concurrently with the design, installation, and operation of these temporary treatment facilities, we'll be working on designing and beginning construction on the permanent solution as quickly as possible, because we don't want to have to go from 1 year at $2.5 million to potentially 2 years, which would almost double that amount of money.
What are the planned results of this additional filtration process as to removing the PFAS contaminants? What happens to the filters, for instance, once they're used up? Do they get recycled? How are they disposed of, and at what expense?
Yeah, so we obviously intend to remove all of the PFAS if possible, but since we're talking parts per trillion, that's not guaranteed. Nobody will guarantee that level of removal. So the goal is to at least be below the 20 parts per trillion, the drinking water standard that's coming up in the next few months. As far as what happens to the filters, the media in the filters does get used up, and it's very difficult to dispose of. It becomes known as hazardous waste once it's full of PFAS. And the only way to destroy PFAS is to incinerate it at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is very expensive. Sort of one nice thing with the emergency temporary treatment, the companies that offer these rentals of that equipment include the disposal costs and the rental fee. So at least for the temporary treatment, those costs will already be covered up front. When we design the permanent solution, that'll be figured out during the engineering phase.
Well, how long do we think we're going to need to use this temporary and, as you point out, very expensive treatment process? And what are the factors in making decisions about moving forward on long-term permanent treatment solutions, Corey?
Yeah, well, we hope to limit use of the temporary treatment system to 1 year or so, just to minimize the cost impacts. There's many engineering decisions to be made with regards to the permanent solution. In addition to protecting both public health and the environment, our number one concern is to pay attention to our ratepayers' wallets and make sure that we're making the most cost-effective decisions possible.
Please explain how the DEP information about maximum contamination levels, or MCLs, will affect how the water department will implement long-term solutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, basically knowing that they're going to establish a drinking water standard at 20 parts per trillion as early as this January or February, that means we need to move as quickly as possible. It takes a couple of years to design and build the treatment plant at a minimum. So we're just trying to hit the ground running.
And that kind of follows up with the next question, which is what might the water department need to do to existing plants to meet higher or tighter PFAS requirements? Or is it better to just build a new purpose-built treatment facility? What are the pros and cons of each approach?
Yeah, it's a good question. Our Spectacle Pond treatment facility is already 22 years old, so it's nearing the end of its useful life. Typical treatment plants last 30 to 35 years maybe. So we could get another 10 or 12 years out of it if we invested a couple $1 million into it. That's just for the existing treatment facility. The adding on PFAS treatment to an existing facility is another $3 million or so typically. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to invest $3 million into something that already needs $1 or $2 million just to last 10 more years. So we're looking at various options. So in what turned out to be a blessing in disguise, maybe, we've been delayed on the construction of our Whitcomb Ave treatment plant, which was already fully designed. So we have an opportunity to go back, make relatively minor design modifications to that facility, and pipe the water from our Spectacle Pond well over to there. And there we would build one larger treatment plant instead of having two separate treatment plants, which is obviously more cost effective in the short term as far as construction costs. Building one's cheaper than building two, even if that one is larger than originally planned. And then operationally over the long term, those operational costs are significantly less as well.
So with this new plant that you're talking about, you're going to focus on what contaminants are obviously PFAS, but Whitcomb Ave brings with it a whole slew of different things that I know were originally on the drawing boards to help satisfy. So what were some of those other issues that we're running into over at Whitcomb?
Yeah, the original design for the Whitcomb Ave treatment plant was to remove iron and manganese, which is the primary parameter we're looking to remove in Littleton. Those are naturally occurring minerals that cause a lot of issues. It's what the Spectacle Pond treatment plant is currently removing. So by building a larger plant at Whitcomb Ave, we're able to do what the Spectacle Pond plant has been doing for us, but won't be able to much longer, plus what we were planning on doing for Whitcomb Ave, plus PFAS treatment.
Excellent, excellent. Now for the $1 million questions. How does the timing of the October 28th special town meeting factor into the design process, as the DEP won't be establishing the drinking water standard until January, February of 2020? I know you've talked about what you think they're going to do, but isn't this a moving target in that we have an unfunded mandate from the state about contaminant levels without having necessary funding processes? In other words, January or February, we're not having a town meeting until May of 2020. Is this why the dollar amount for the PFAS treatment plan, the long term, is not available? Because DEP's final standard is still a work in progress?
Well, based on what DEP is telling us right now, we know that we're going to need at least $2.5 million for temporary treatment in the January to February timeframe. It's possible it's March or April, but regardless, we're going to need it before the next town meeting. So that's why the $2.5 million was included in the initial draft of the town meeting article. The second draft that came up had a number of $6 million in there. And that came about because, as I mentioned earlier, we want to minimize the amount of time we're relying on the expensive temporary treatment and begin design and construction of the permanent solution as quickly as possible. So by increasing that amount to $6 million, that gives us the 2.5 for emergency treatment, plus 3.5 to get started on the permanent solution for PFAS. So I want to stress that point that we will be back at Springtown meeting in 2020 requesting additional funding, because the permanent solution is going to take significantly more than that $3.5 million. I should also mention we have $7 million that was appropriated for the original Whitcomb Ave treatment plant at the May 2018 town meeting. We've only spent the design money on that, which is less than 10% of that. So we have that money to work with as well. But again, I want to stress the point that there will be additional funding requests at the Springtown meeting to completely solve the PFAS problem.
Okay. All right, well, I feel a little bit better as far as the million-dollar numbers that are being passed back and forth and understanding where the target will be. We want to thank Corey Godfrey for coming in today and explaining the possible plans for dealing with PFAS contaminants in our public water supply. Stay tuned for the next Watts and Drops episode when we have Nick Lawler back to talk about the implementation of the long-term treatment of PFAS contaminants. And thank you for watching.